It's local 615 of Janus Union. It's in the 7th Engineers here. Local 615 is the one that initiated it, Janus Union SEIU, and then a lot of other unions that come forward. We have the engineers.
Can you tell me how you'd like to see that? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a big and a whole lot of students from the performance from the performance and the caucus now bring together different liberals on campus. We're trying to my name is Mike. Coordinated number of promises. I mean, there's been improvements in wages and certain sectors, but Harvard has been not a living wage. It's $19.3 billion.
I know you have to run out after this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
There's I know there's 8,000 units. Yes. I'm not sure I have it on the front.
Excellent.
But it's layoffs. It's we're demanding
I guess we have to start actually.
Okay.
Sorry.
You'll get me a sheet?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to have a clip-on or handheld?
Anything? Anything.
Usually stand.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll need one handheld to go around to students with questions. So you can choose one if you get one.
Why don't we pass a handheld back and forth?
Okay. Here.
Oh, I see. That's like squirrels. I don't
Yeah.
care. Either one.
I'm thrilled to come. Testing. We're not there. We're not. So that's maybe why. Oh, okay. Howard Zinn was just here. So Howard Zinn was just here?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
He was wonderful. And Noam Chomsky, who you were with
Last
yesterday.
night.
So can I just write down the broadcast schedule that you can set?
Oh, wait a minute.
Cambridge, Somerville, and ABC.
Yeah, you can put on the board what channels and what time.
Okay, Chuck Rosina from
And who's doing Daily Digest?
Welcome. We'll get started.
We are, we're not on, right?
no, and ally in East.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If I can have your attention. It's a pleasure to introduce two exceptionally courageous journalists, Amy Goodman and her brother David Goodman. Amy Goodman graduated from Harvard in 1984 and went to New York. She volunteered at a radio station, WBAI, and was soon hired as their news anchor. Her radio and print journalism has taken her to sites of conflict in the former Yugoslavia, Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, Palestine, Israel, and most famously, East Timor. There in East Timor, she was badly beaten by soldiers while alerting the world of a massacre in which 250 people were shot. For that work and other reportage, she has won more than a dozen major journalistic prizes. And this month, the book that Amy and David have co-authored, The Exception to the Rulers, has just been published. For those interested, copies will be available at the end of the hour. In today's America, as you are aware, a few very large corporations control almost all of the major media. Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Network is perhaps the most important exception to their rule, their hegemony. In this class, we've once before been privileged to interview people who work as a team, Eugene and Jacqueline Rivers, and today it's a privilege to have a brother and sister team. David Goodman was also a Harvard graduate, class of '83, had been active in the anti-apartheid movement and became a journalist after graduating, writing for the Washington Post and other publications, and publishing a book, Fault Lines, Journeys into the New South Africa. Please join me in welcoming Amy and David Goodman.
Thank you.
And as you know, we work from questions, and I thought to take the privilege of asking the first one to Amy. Many of our graduating seniors are eager to make a difference in the world, to do some kind of work that serves others, but they find that there seem to be few jobs in sectors where that's possible, and lots of jobs in investment banking and consulting. When you graduated from Harvard, what did your life look like? And did you feel that it was risky to go to New York and volunteer for a radio station when your classmates were joining Goldman Sachs?
Well, first of all, I had taken 5 years off from college. I'm actually older than David. We both lived at 3 SAC in '05 at the Dudley Co-op. And I had left Harvard because I was so busy protesting outside that I felt I wasn't exactly taking advantage of the courses. At that time, it was the anti-apartheid movement and Harvard's huge investment in apartheid South Africa. But I came back and was very interested at the time in nutrition and the politics of food and nutrition. Got a degree in anthropology, did my thesis on a contraceptive drug called Depo-Provera, which is injected into women every 3 months, and at the time not approved by the FDA, but many people all over the world did not understand that it caused cancer in beagles and monkeys. And in this country, I learned that 10,000 black women in Atlanta, Georgia, had been injected with the, quote, shot, not knowing it was not approved by the government. I couldn't afford to go overseas for my thesis to investigate how it would be being injected into women in Thailand and other places. So I went down to Atlanta, Georgia. When I finished the thesis, I'll just tell one brief story. I had to defend it. And I thought, boy, doing all this research and what a difference it makes for women to understand the effect of drugs and looking at science and society, and particularly how it affected women. was sitting before the panel of professors in anthropology defending the thesis, and they looked at it, and one of them said, as he smoked his pipe, Miss Goodman, do you understand what anthropology is? Because this is not an anthropology thesis. And I said, well, why is that? And so he said, because anthropology, Miss Goodman, is looking at someone else's culture, being an outsider looking in. You seem to have missed somewhere in your education the basic principles of anthropology. And I said, well, using that definition, I am looking here at white male corporate science in the United States, and it's not a culture I'm part of. So I think it really does fit into the definition of anthropology. He said, carry on. And so finishing the thesis, I thought, well, this isn't particularly going to help him. I didn't expect he would be injected with Depo-Provera, but it would matter to a lot of people. So even when you're here, if you've done work, for example, in your theses, think about making it public, not just as a paper here. We take for granted the level of research that people do in college classes that could help so many people. So I left Harvard and went back home to New York, and I was turning the thesis into a series of articles with another Harvard classmate named Christina von Henneberg. And I was at home at my parents' house where I grew up, and I turned on the radio, and I heard this amazing radio station, WBAI. I didn't grow up with it, even though I grew up in New York. And I thought, what is this place? It is so authentic, so real, all of the accents of New York City, not trying to sell you anything, all of the glory and horror of New York, right there. And I was just transfixed. So I kept doing the series of articles, and it came out in an issue of the Multinational Monitor called The Case Against Depo-Provera. By the way, it has since been approved and is being used by women, maybe some of you, here in this country. But I thought, I wonder how you get involved with something like this. But I was still interested in biochemistry and nutrition. When I had come back, I had mainly taken courses at the School of Public Health. And I remember being in the class, in the nutrition class there, and someone asked the professor about the effects of sugar. And I had worked in an organic whole grain bakery for years in Maine when I'd taken time off. And he said that it was a myth that sugar was unhealthy. And I thought, well, what an odd thing to say. And then I walked out of class. It was this Harvard School of Public Health, and I saw, as I'm walking down the hall we're in, I see a big plaque to Domino's Sugar. Okay, well, that explains that. Anyway, so there I was listening to this radio station, and I was taking a class at Hunter College, a graduate class in biochemistry. So they were teaching class in radio documentary. I thought, oh, that is the class. That is radio documentary, like that radio station I'm listening to. So I went over, joined the first class. The teacher, the professor, was a producer at WBAI. And he was starting a program the next week called Investigations. He had a speech impediment. He's from Australia. And so I asked him, so he said I could apprentice with him. And we walked over to WBAI that night, and I never left. I found at the beginning of my career what people, if they're lucky, find at the end of their career, and that is independence. And I volunteered for a time working with him. He got a grant to investigate Hiroshima 40 years later, the bombing, and he was able to pay me a little bit. But then I quickly joined the newsroom doing pieces there and then went on staff. So that investment at the beginning certainly made an enormous difference. I did the news for 10 years, then did the morning show, and in 1996, we started Democracy Now!, which is the only daily election show, was the only daily election show in public broadcasting. Now it is 8 years later, and this radio program that broadcast on a couple dozen radio stations 2 years ago is now the largest public media collaboration in the country. We broadcast on over 220 Pacifica radio stations and affiliates, NPR stations, public access TV stations, a wonderful place, by the way, to make your own media, your public access TV station. We're now broadcasting on our first PBS station, and we broadcast on Dish Network, channel 9415, which is Free Speech TV. And we video and audio stream on the web at democracynow.org, and across Canada, across Australia on radio stations, and through Europe. So it is very exciting. 2 to 3 stations are picking us up a week. And it is the whole idea of doing unembedded, independent, international, grassroots news reporting. That's how I got my start.
David, what brought you to South Africa?
Protests at Harvard. When I was a student here, one of the real burning issues was the apartheid in South Africa, and there was a nationwide divestment movement to get universities to divest. Universities have some of the largest pools of capital, of investment money, and have tremendous power to make a difference. Well, Harvard had, trying to remember, it was something like $1 billion. It was a lot of money. $500 million or $1 billion invested in companies doing business in South Africa. So that was probably the single biggest focus of my extracurricular activities here, was participating in the anti-apartheid movement at school. We, at one point, closed the university for 3 days with just constant round-the-clock protests, occupying Mass Hall. This was hugely significant, what Harvard did. If Harvard were to do something with its funds and to pull out of South Africa, it would show the world. It would have repercussions way beyond the Charles River. And basically, it was the first domino. We knew that. And if Harvard continued, at the time the president was Derek Bach, this became such a big deal. He was forced into multiple rounds of conversations, some of which took place in this room with the students. And this really shaped my view. I saw that we could have an impact. We succeeded in, we were trying to apply pressure from all sides. We elected people to the Board of Overseers of Harvard, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the leading anti-apartheid cleric of South Africa. We got him elected to Harvard's board. So alumni were involved, undergrads, graduates, and faculty members. And it's one of those things where at the time it was a very radical thing to ask for Harvard to take a moral stand about what it does with its money. Now it was considered passé. Harvard did ultimately divest after years of saying why this really made no difference. The moral stand was to stay involved. Of course, this was the greatest encouragement the apartheid regime had, was to point to institutions like Harvard, who basically gave a seal of approval to what was going on in South Africa. So the thread that led from here, when I got out of school, at the time it was the mid-'80s, a lot of my friends were going to Central America, Nicaragua in particular, had just had a revolution. There was a lot of hope and optimism about the kind of new nation that could be built there. But I was intrigued about this place that we had been chanting about in Harvard Yard and beyond, about South Africa. And there was the representative of the African National Congress in Boston was a man named Themba Vilakazi, and Themba would come to campus and give the most inspiring speeches. I mean, we would all be, thousands of students would gather around him in Harvard Yard, and he would talk about, as a South African, what it meant, why he was coming here. So I said, at the time we were planning to go to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had just won its freedom after years of white rule, because the only word ever associated with South Africa was the word boycott. You didn't buy from there, you didn't go there. So I said to Themba, A friend of mine was editing a newspaper, now defunct, called the Cambridge Express, and he asked me to do some freelance stories for him, which I started to do. And then I got this idea, well, putting one and one together, writer, journalism, South Africa, anti-apartheid stuff, and slowly kind of began to weave a circle of maybe I could pull all this together. So Temba's words stuck in my mind when I said, so I'm going to Zimbabwe. Of course, we wouldn't go to South Africa because we're supposed to boycott there, right? And Temba laughed, and I said, and he said, if you can go, you should go and see with your own eyes what apartheid is. He said, but if you go, you must come back and tell people what you see. That's your obligation. And I feel like I've been doing that ever since. I went at the height of the apartheid years in South Africa, which was the 1980s. For all the times I was told at Harvard that my activism here made no difference, that divestment made no difference, it made a hell of a difference when we were over there talking to black South Africans. They knew about Harvard. They knew about the American companies that were profiting from slave labor there. They knew it all. And time and again, we were told here, your students, this is youthful kind of idealism. You'll grow out of it. And the people who inspired me most here, in fact, were older activists, and I used to seek them out. There was a man named George Wald, a Nobel laureate in biology. George became one of the most prominent peace activists in the 70s and 80s, using his cachet as a Nobel laureate to talk about peace. And I just would go to talk to him and ask him, well, how come you didn't grow out of it? And, he would talk about the lifelong commitment he had and also the overcoming the skepticism and cynicism of people around you. So all I would say is, so then the quick version from there, I was writing from South Africa and about South Africa for, The Nation and The Progressive, and then some for the Boston Globe, and then continued going back and forth to South Africa over the years. And finally, in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected president. And this was a brief moment. For 5 years, Nelson Mandela would be president of South Africa. And my wife, my girlfriend at the time in Harvard, and was then my wife, and I realized, this is a moment in history. This is like a chance to see Gandhi in India or Martin Luther King at work in America. We can go now and see Nelson Mandela in South Africa and see a country reinventing itself. And so we moved there for a year. I ended up writing a book, Fault Lines, Journeys into the New South Africa, about it. But I'd say the best thing I did was to ignore the people at Harvard who told me that you'll grow out of it, because the work that you do now for change, the protests you're going to this afternoon, makes a huge difference, and you can be doing it your whole life.
And now we have a question from Brandon Molina.
Amy, you have dedicated your life to your career in pursuit of journalistic integrity. In retrospect, do you think it is necessary to forsake the idea of family, given your own experience as a successful reporter, journalist, and activist? Also, do you have any regrets or feel as though you've missed out on anything because you've dedicated your life to social activism?
I don't know who actually said this, but it was a quote that always sticks with me. Now I'll probably forget it. It is, I think back on my life at all the times I thought I went too far. And I realize now I didn't go far enough. There is so much that has to be done. And family can be defined in so many different ways. I have a wonderful family that I was born into. It was an incredible privilege to be able to do this book with my brother, David. and my other brothers, my parents who were such inspirations, my grandparents, my grandmother is celebrating her 107th birthday this week. My mom is here. My mother, who is a peace activist and taught women's studies at local colleges and was a social worker. My nieces and nephews, my friends who are as close as my family, friends I made here in college. The people I cover, I would say in many cases have become extended family. And there's just so much that has to be done. It's not about sacrifice, though. I get great joy out of my work. It's incredible the entree that you have with just a microphone into people's lives and the trust that they place in you. Maybe briefly, I'll tell the story of East Timor, which is a story that we write about in The Exception to the Rulers, the book that we just finished. The idea, the exception to the rulers, which is what all media should be and has fallen so far short of, the media reaching an all-time low now in this country. But it's not just about media. I think of that as the most important role to play in life, the exception to the rulers. But I had the experience of being able to go to Timor. How many of you know the story of East Timor, just very roughly? Which is fantastic. And I bet you know it for two reasons. One, possibly Noam Chomsky, who wrote about it forever. And the other, because of independent media. You're not going to get it from other places in this country. I was just talking to the Neiman Journalism Fellows yesterday, and they objected to the fact that I said the corporate media hardly covered this for well over a decade. It's one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Indonesia invaded East Timor in 1975. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. Gerald Ford was the president. They went to Indonesia. They met with Suharto the day before the invasion and gave the go-ahead for the invasion. Suharto, the long-reigning dictator in Indonesia. And on December 7th, 1975, the Indonesian military invaded by land, by air, by sea, killing thousands of Timorese, leading to the deaths of 10,000 Timorese and then tens of thousands. They closed the country to the outside world, and for the next 17 years, they killed off a third of the population, proportionally worse than what happened in Cambodia. In 1990, I got a chance to go to Timor with my colleague Alan Nairn, and we found a true hell on earth. In 1991, we went back because for the first time, a delegation was going to go, commissioned by the UN, and they were going to go to investigate the human rights situation. We wanted to see what happened. Alan and I followed a procession one day, November 12th, 1991, of 1,000 people that walked from the church, the main Catholic church in Dili, Timor, 300 miles above Australia, a small Catholic country that had been colonized by Portugal for many years. Then it was going independent and Indonesia invaded. So on this day, the people were marching from the church to the cemetery. The people, they were around your age, many of them. There were thousands. Old women in their traditional Timorese garb, girls in their Catholic school uniforms, boys in their school shorts. And they marched, and they unfurled banners that they'd written on bed sheets that said things like, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church?" And they appealed to President Bush, Sr. at the time. They appealed to the UN, anyone, to do something about this killing field. And they marched to the cemetery. It was the biggest act of civil disobedience the Indonesian military had ever seen, a land of no freedom of assembly, no freedom of press, no freedom of speech. And when they got to the cemetery, everyone was crowded around. They were exhilarated, though very afraid. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of people had joined from home, work, school. And then we saw from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s at the ready position. People at the back could run away, but they were hemmed in by the walls of the cemetery. And the soldiers marched up 12 to 15 abreast. Alan and I were asking people, "Why are you here?" They'd say, "For my mother, for my sister, for my brother, for my village that was wiped out." And then we saw these soldiers marching up. I put my headphones on. I always hid everything so that the soldiers wouldn't see us interviewing Timorese. It would only endanger them. But now we knew this might be the only hope. If the soldiers saw Western journalists, they'd committed many massacres in the past, but never in front of Western journalists. Put my headphones on, held up my microphone like a flag. Alan put the camera above his head. He was writing for the New Yorker magazine at the time. I was doing a documentary for Pacifica. And we walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up 12 to 15 abreast. They rounded the corner without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation. They swept past us and they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down, a little boy behind us, just exploded from the gunfire. And they kept on shooting. They beat me to the ground. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire, and then he threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury. And they took their USM-16s and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. We were lying in the road. Alan was covered in blood. Timorese were being killed all around us, and then a group of the soldiers came up and they put their guns to our heads in firing squad fashion. They were screaming, politique, politique, because to bear witness is political. They were also screaming, Australia, were we from Australia? We knew what had happened to the Australian journalists in 1975 at the time of the invasion. They had lined 5 of them up against a house and executed them. There was one left the day after the invasion. They dragged him out of the radio station in Dili, the capital. His name was Roger East. He was reporting for the World, and as he shouted he was from Australia, they shot him into the harbor. The Australian government hardly raised a peep about these killings, maybe because a few years later they would sign the Timor Gap Treaty with Indonesia, dividing up the oil spoils that belonged to Timor between Indonesia and Australia. Oil has been the source of so much pain in the world. Anyway, as we lay in the ground, we said, no, we're not from Australia. America, America. We were stripped of everything at that point, lying in the road, and the only thing I had left was my passport, and I threw it at them. At some point, they decided to take the guns from our heads. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from. They would have to pay a price for killing us. They'd never had to pay for killing the Timorese, and they moved on. A Red Cross Jeep pulled up. We got into it. Dozens of Timorese jumped on top of it and on top of us, and we drove like that as a human mass to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us. We were not in worse shape than the Timorese. Hundreds of Timorese were killed on that day, and the number matters, more than 270. But I think they cried because of what we represent to the people, not only of East Timor, but all over the world. 2 things. One is the sword, and the other the shield. The sword, because all too often the U.S. government provides military weapons to repressive regimes or uses them against other populations themselves. But Americans also represent the shield. The idea that every little act we engage in makes such a difference in the world because we come from the most powerful country on earth. Just a call to a Congress member, a walk to Holyoke Center protesting for workers' rights is heard around the world, especially when you come from the most powerful institution in the most powerful country in the world. It makes an enormous difference, and they know that. And on that day, that shield was bloody, and it just increased their despair. Well, after that, a nationwide movement grew up in this country. I remember in 1992 being at Kennedy School, speaking along with Noam Chomsky and Alan Nairn and with a member of the State Department at the Kennedy School, which almost shut down our talk. There were a lot of ties between Kennedy School, Business School, and Indonesia at the time, but fortunately, my younger brother organized the event and didn't let it happen. He made sure that it did happen. Persistence, by the way, in all of your activities, whatever you do. If you want to volunteer, volunteer hard, volunteer a lot of hours. If you get a low-paying job to do something at the beginning, just work a lot. Your hard work absolutely pays off. But in '99, the people of East Timor got a chance to vote. Incredible what they had asked for all these years. And in 2002, they won their freedom. And Alan Nairn and I returned May 19th, 2002, to join with the people of East Timor to cover them as they celebrated their independence. Out on the sandy plain of Tasitolo, outside of Dili, the people gathered 100,000 strong. And as the clock struck midnight, Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of East Timor, now the founding president, ascended the stage and raised the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. And the people looked up at the fireworks display, and you could see the light of the display in their tear-stained faces. This nation of survivors had won. They had resisted, and they had won, though they had paid an unbelievably high price. And they won because of their own persistence and resistance, but also because of the solidarity of people all over the world. They knew they couldn't do it without them. And it left an indelible image. Everywhere I go, every day I do the broadcast, but beyond that, for all of us, we understand, I think, and it's important to know, whatever age you are, whatever you're doing, whether you're a student or a professor, employed or unemployed, a janitor, a painter, working in the school bookstore or in the cafeteria, every hour of every day, we have a decision to make, and that is whether to be the sword or the shield.
Melissa Herman.
Thank you for being here. When describing your interview with former President Clinton, Michael Powell said that you are the reporter who sinks her teeth in and never lets go, and that your questions prompted Clinton to scold. You have asked questions in a hostile, combative, and even disrespectful tone. Is it necessary or worthwhile to ask the difficult questions in a tone like Clinton describes? And are the difficult questions more or less effective when they are asked in this tone?
The question is if Clinton had described me as hostile, combative, and even disrespectful, and should I adopt that tone? Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that that's how he characterized it. Because those in power take any kind of questioning in that way. I'll describe what happened that day. We describe it in the exception to the rulers in detail. It was Election Day 2000. We're about to go on the air. Remember that day that we thought would end with learning the results of who would be president of the United States, but we found out 5 weeks later who would be, no, not elected, but selected. But that morning, we're about to go on the air. It was like 2 minutes to 9. No one calls us at that time unless there's a breaking story because we have so much to do. And I get a call on the phone. They say, "Hi, this is White House Communications." And I thought they said White Horse Communications, which is a tavern in New York, White Horse, where Dylan Thomas died, drank himself to death. And I couldn't understand why they would be calling. And so I said, "What do you want?" And so they said, "The president would like to talk to you." I thought, there's a president of the White Horse Tavern? And he's awake at 9 o'clock in the morning? So anyway, I said, the president of what? The president of the United States. Oh. Now it's 1 minute to 9, and they're screaming for me to get into master control, and then I hear the music on, so I said, whatever. I didn't really believe it. Yeah, he can call. We'll pick up the phone. I didn't really believe it, and I didn't want to put this on the producers who were getting ready for the show, so I just said, guys, I think they said the president of the United States might call, so think of some questions as we're doing the show. He didn't call for the hour. So then we were done. We're going to have coffee. It was going to be a long day. It's election day. We're just about to go out, and someone screams from master control. Latino music programmer was on. The president is on the phone. Oh, my God. We race in. The programmer was almost paralyzed. He had all of the music faders up, all of the mics down, and you hear in the salsa music, "Hello, is anyone there?" It was the president of the United States. Oh my God, I jump over the control board, I push up all the faders for the microphones so the whole room is hot, every microphone is on, and I bring down the music and I said, "Yes, Mr. President. I understand you're calling to get out the vote. Why should people vote? Many people feel both the Democratic and Republican parties are captured by the corporations. What difference does a person's vote make?" And he answered the question. And he was still there, and I said, what about Leonard Peltier, the late Native American leader? President Clinton was considering whether to grant him clemency. It would be the first time he would address that issue. Now, mind you, I hadn't planned for this, but while he was on the phone, and no one had ever asked him about this publicly, and he talked about it, saying he would make a decision. And then I asked him about the death penalty and why he chose to go back in his first term when he was running for president to Arkansas to preside over the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, who was brain damaged. And then asked him about the racial disparities, all the studies that have come out about who gets the death penalty. And President Clinton said this was why we should vote for Hillary Clinton and Al Gore. And I was a little confused, and I said, well, why? They're for the death penalty. And he said, yes, but they understand those studies. And I was thinking, well, wait a second. So it's better to vote for someone who is for this and understands the implications than someone who doesn't understand the implications and is for this? And then I asked him about the sanctions against Iraq at the time and about the UN Assistant Secretary Generals, too, who had quit, saying they were genocidal. He said they were liars, they weren't telling the truth. Asked him about Ralph Nader, asked him a number of questions. Asked him about racial profiling. Al Gore said if he was president, it's the first act if when he was in office he would outlaw it. But I said, you were both in power for 8 years. Why didn't you do it then? You know, the promise versus the record. Anyway, at some point he made that comment. Now, I had given him a chance in full to answer every question. But I think the reason he said that was because presidents rarely get asked tough questions. In this country, journalists treat them as royalty on bended knee. They're simply the employees of the American people. And when this opportunity arose, I felt it was my responsibility to ask the questions so many people had asked for so long. For example, also about the bombing of Vieques, you know, the napalming and bombing of this island that was part of the United States. The next day, the White House called and basically said I would be banned from going to the White House. And I said, what are you talking about? He called me. I didn't call him. And they said I didn't follow the protocol. And I said, what protocol? The questions we'd agreed to. Who'd agreed to? And I said, did other reporters? They said, we said he would talk about getting out the vote. And maybe they said 1, 4, and 7, your questions, those questions were related. But the others, I said, I made no agreement. I submitted no questions to you. And they said, we said he had 2 or 3 minutes. I said, for God's sakes, he's the most powerful man in the world. He can hang up if he wants to. And we talk about that in the exception to the rulers, what this means and why it is that these kinds of questions aren't asked. We also have a chapter on the lies of our times, actually 2 chapters, critiquing the New York Times coverage of the invasion and their overall coverage of those in power. And it makes me think of Elizabeth Buehmiller of the New York Times, who recently was asked at a forum why they didn't ask tougher questions on the eve of the invasion with one of President Bush's extremely rare news conferences. And she said, because the weight of history was on our shoulders. That's exactly when you ask the question. When you look at how many U.S. servicemen and women have died in Iraq, if those questions aren't asked, it does a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country, not to mention how many Iraqi civilians have died, over 10,000, the people the U.S. administration supposedly went in to liberate and to save. I didn't consider that hostile questioning. I simply considered it doing my job.
Richard Krumholtz.
First, thanks very much for coming today. My question for you both is, in the last 20 years, the dialogue between conservatives and liberals has gotten harsher and more extreme. In Washington, contempt and disrespect for the opposing party has reached a high is not seen in at least 50 years. Do you think that this polarization of the American political scene is good for America? And if not, what type of role do you see yourself playing in this problem?
Okay, just repeat the last part of that question where you asked the question part.
Yes, do you think that this polarization of the American political scene is good for America? And if not, what type of role do you see yourself playing in this problem?
Well, I'll start. You know, right now we're dealing with issues of life and death. That's pretty polarizing. When the choice that a young person makes, you know, I've in various magazine articles I've written over the last few years, I've done a lot of looking at the role of the military in the schools, looking at junior ROTC programs in high schools and ROTC programs in colleges. These kids are not getting into these programs. About half the kids in junior ROTC programs in high school wind up in the military. They're not going there because they wanted to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan. They're going there because it's often the only ticket that they see out of the inner city where unemployment rates are 50 and 60-some%, where you're lucky if you make it to high school graduation because you don't get shot dead. You know, so when I would talk to these kids, and it's also getting younger and younger. You know, it's illegal for the Pentagon to recruit. You can't sign up for the military until you're 18. And it's illegal for them to recruit, I think, under 17 or 16 years old. Well, I was in Chicago right after 9/11, and Chicago has the highest number of students in public school in uniform of any school district in the country, 9,000 students in uniform. You'd think you'd walked onto a military base. In fact, 3 public high schools in Chicago have been converted to all military schools. So the Pentagon's not allowed to do junior ROTC below high school. But they were so enthused about this program. The only part of the educational system that was not being defunded in Chicago was the one that the military funded. So I was in a class with 11 and 12-year-olds who could not officially be called junior ROTC because Pentagon, that's a high school program. So they called them cadets. And they got berets, they got uniforms, and it was in a class like this, and the teacher, I asked to speak to a couple kids, and the teacher just said, well, why don't you come into a cadets class? And she had me interview a class like this. So I said, this is now, we're talking 7th graders. I said, so what do you guys think war is? One girl raised her hand. She said, oh, I think it's cool, you know. And another girl raised her hand and says, yeah, you know, you come home, you get to use all those weapons, you come home, you're like a movie star, man. You get to ride in those fancy cars and stuff. Anyway, the point of all this is these kids had no idea, and if statistics are right, half of them will wind up in the military. And now we know where that'll lead. So, on the question of polarization and why it's so, I mean, I think it's appropriate and important that it be polarized now when the issues at stake are life and death, when a government has lied to us consistently for the last 2 years, and those lies have led not gung-ho, rah-rah cheerleaders into war, but kids who've been recruited since they were, 12 years old, who are now finding themselves on the front lines of people who are not their enemy. I think polarization is a very healthy, a sign of real health in our both political society and our civil society, that people see the lies for what they are and are objecting.
Before we thank our guests, 2 announcements. As this session was added to our syllabus, later there's no response paper due. And second, those who would like to see the brand new book, The Exception to the Rulers, can get a copy in the back of the room, and I think that the authors will be around for signing. Amy Goodman and David Goodman, for your example of courage in the pursuit of truth, we thank you. It'll go on again in a few seconds. Try now.
I just wanted to say that we're offering the book at the back, Exception to the Rulers, Exposing Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them. And for those people who get 2 books, we have a DVD that we usually show in longer sessions called Independent Media in a Time of War. It's on our website for $30, but we give it for free to those who get 2 books. You can also go to our website, and it dissects the corporate media's coverage of war. One other thing is tonight at the Harvard Film Archive, 7 p.m., Carpenter Center, BO4, Rick Rowley and Jackie Suin's film, The Fourth World War. It's a fantastic film. Jackie and Rick also used to live at Dudley House Co-op.